I actually remember what I was supposed to be talking about this morning. But in the meantime, let me just say thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I guess I see my role this morning as mostly cheerleader, but I'm hoping that I can maybe impart some information that you haven't heard before about the impacts of climate change on the New England region and how it might intersect with what you guys do on a regular basis. But first I wanted to tell you, because a number of people asked last night as I was hanging out at the reception, how I ended up doing what I'm doing. I was 12 years old when I went to a summer camp run by the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. 3 weeks, about a dozen 12 and 13-year-olds, and we started at the very, very top of Chesapeake Bay and worked our way almost to the very bottom of Chesapeake Bay on a converted crabbing boat, camping along the way and doing a ton of water quality testing. And in particular, I remember going into Baltimore Inner Harbor and watching the pH meter drop and drop and drop until we got down to somewhere, I don't know, in the 4-ish range, you know, Coke, vinegar, and that was Baltimore Inner Harbor in, what would that have been, around 1988. And then a night or two later, we were at a state park, and I got my first introduction to a Clivus multrum composting toilet. Thought that was really quite cool. We kept going and made it all the way down to some of the islands in the southern Chesapeake Bay that have made their living off of crabbing for hundreds of years. And it was a really transformational experience. I got home and I said to my mom, "Mom, the oceans are in trouble. I'm going to be a marine biologist. I have to save the oceans." Right, as with only the hubris that a 12-year-old can muster. And then, being the type A personality that I am, I kind of put on my blinders, and I went for about 10 years. I went through high school and college and straight into graduate school. I'm going to become a marine biologist. And I did. I got my PhD from Winslow Oceanographic Institution just the way I said I wanted to, but I got to the end of that and realized I had been miserable for 6 years in graduate school, like more miserable than most graduate students. But strangely, I'd actually really enjoyed writing my thesis, which makes most scientists cringe. And I realized that what I loved about science was thinking about science and talking about science. I didn't really like doing science so much, which is how I found myself in my current role as a reporter. I get to think about science and talk about science a lot, and I don't have to do any of the hard work. But also in becoming a reporter, and in particular an environmental reporter, I found my inner infrastructure geek. I have found myself in basements, on roofs, in physical plants, most recently last week at a small-scale commercial composting facility and at an anaerobic digester in Freetown, Massachusetts. A lot of the work that really matters to making our environment livable for us and for all of the other species happens, as you guys all know, in hidden places and out of the public eye. It's not just about beautiful parks where people go for walks. There's a lot of really important work that happens in basements and water resource recovery facilities. I will remember that one. And it's really, really important work. So thank you for the work that you do. But we're facing a really huge challenge. And it's a challenge that I'm pretty sure most of you are already familiar with on a daily basis. I'm curious how many of you, I won't make you stand up, but raise your hand if you think that your organization and those perhaps setting regulations or rules for you are adequately accounting for climate change at this point. Not a lot of hands. We have a big challenge, and we haven't quite caught up to it yet. Climate change, as the commissioner has already said, is real. It is primarily caused by humans, and it presents a real and present danger, not just to people on the other side of the planet, but here in New England. We've already raised global average temperatures close to 1 degree Celsius, and while that may not sound like a huge change, it's changing our water cycle dramatically. We've already seen about a 5% increase in specific humidity, so in the amount of water that's living in the atmosphere instead of in rivers or lakes or the ocean. And that then has major repercussions for our weather systems. That's what feeds storms like Superstorm Sandy, like many of the storms that we've seen hit New York and New England in the past few years and wreak such havoc. But in addition, the carbon dioxide and the heat that's being trapped by it is not just in the atmosphere. That's what we tend to hear about. How much are we warming the atmosphere? We don't talk about necessarily how much are we warming the planet's water. And of course, 3/4 of our planet is covered with water. And 30% of the carbon dioxide that we've put into the atmosphere over the past 150 or so years has ended up in the ocean. That has dramatically changed ocean chemistry. Not like Baltimore Inner Harbor, we're not seeing pH 4, but we have seen a 30% increase in acidity of the oceans. And that's pretty phenomenal when you stop and think about the volume of water that sits in our oceans. Even ocean scientists up until about 10 years ago didn't really think that we would be able to change the pH of the ocean, and yet we already have, and it's continuing to happen. That has major implications for our shellfish industry here in New England, as well as others. We've also seen in our oceans, they're not only absorbing the carbon dioxide, the ocean has absorbed over 90%. The vast, vast majority of the excess heat that's trapped by greenhouse gases ends up in the ocean. And that has a huge range of impacts. So we're seeing here in New England a major shift in our fisheries, and in Long Island Sound, one of the most dramatic impacts, and one of the stories that I've been trying to tell for at least 5 years at this point, is the southern New England lobster fishery, which at this point is really, really struggling. This was always the southern end of the range for lobsters, but at this point, the fishery is really struggling and struggling to figure out if there is a future for lobstering in Long Island Sound and southern New England, because water temperatures have simply gotten too high for lobsters. On the other hand, we are seeing efforts to adapt to some of these changes, and I want to highlight another one from this area that about a week ago I saw a story that says Long Island Sound fishermen trying to ward off fish kills that were seen last year, and this was specifically with regard to menhaden. And I read this article, it was a pretty quick article, and it basically said, well, what's happening is fishermen are going out with seine nets and weirs, and they're going to catch as many of the menhaden as possible so that they don't get up into the river and then all die, because the water temperatures have risen so high. Of course, warmer water holds less oxygen, and there were major fish kills last year. I'll have to forgive me, I don't remember exactly which river it was along the Connecticut coastline where this was kind of particularly the focus. But I read the story, and I posted it on Facebook with what I have to say is a pretty flip analysis, and said, all right, so let me see if I got this right. The way we're going to adapt to climate change and prevent fish kills is not by solving the problem, but by catching all the fish first. And had a number of, a small number, but a handful of people far more involved in fisheries management write back and say, no. That's not the right attitude. This is actually a success story of adaptive dynamic fisheries management, because we can't change the water temperature in the river. But what we can do is give fishermen the right to go and catch as much of their quota here instead of over here, or instead of later in the season, to give them the ability to catch their menhaden quota right here, right now, prevent the fish kill, meet their fishing quota, and do that in a dynamic way that has not typically been the way fisheries were managed. This is actually a success story. So I had to go back and say, okay, this is an important thing, that sometimes we need to look at things in a different way. We are adapting to a very new world, and we're going to have to do things differently and sometimes think really outside of the box. Also, in terms of rising water temperatures, it's not just fisheries, but of course, anybody who's ever boiled a pot of water knows that you can start with this much water, and as soon as you boil it, you've boiled your pot over, right? As water warms, it expands, and as the oceans warm, a little bit of warming can do a lot when you have the volume that you have in the ocean. And so about half of sea level rise is due simply to water expanding as it warms. As water gets warmer, it also can help melt the ice that's in contact with it, whether that's Arctic sea ice or the ice shelves around Antarctica and Greenland where they stick out over the ocean. Scientists are coming more and more to realize that actually water is doing just as much as the air to melt these glaciers. And of course, that meltwater then contributes to sea level rise. We are looking at something like probably 1.5 to 2 feet of sea level rise coming up here in New England, we've already seen close to a foot in the past century, but we're looking at probably another 1.5 to 2 feet in the next 50 years. So in the lifespan of infrastructure built now, we're looking at a significant change in sea level, let alone what we'll see further into the future. And here in New England, we have a couple of additional factors when it comes to sea level rise. We're actually seeing some of the fastest rates of sea level rise here in New England of anywhere in the globe, and that's because in addition to these more global factors of water expansion and ice melting, New England is still feeling the effects of the last ice age. So as the glaciers retreated from Cape Cod and the islands where I live up into New England, the land got lighter and rose. But as those glaciers continued to retreat up into Canada and up into the Arctic, we're now actually sinking. It's like being on a seesaw. We got to rise right after the glaciers receded, but we're now sinking a little bit. And then in addition to that, we all know we have the Gulf Stream off of our coasts, and that does incredible things for our ocean ecosystems. But another thing that it does for us is that as that Gulf Stream goes up and offshore, it pulls water away from the shore with it. As water warms and as Greenland glaciers are melting, the Gulf Stream is actually slowing down a little bit, and it lets water pile up against New England's coast. There was a pretty dramatic event in 2009-2010 where there was a 30% slowdown in the Gulf Stream, and we had 5 extra inches of water along the New England coast. It took scientists a year or two to figure out why on earth we had so many problems with flooding that year when the storms didn't seem that much different. And it was because the Gulf Stream was having a sluggish year. So we have some real challenges in terms of sea level rise, but it doesn't stop there. And at some point I will get to the good news, I promise. Warming air and water means that salinity in the ocean is changing. And when you change the salinity, you start changing how water evaporates and when and where we get precipitation and cloud formation over the oceans. In addition to that, there are a number of other conditions and factors that play into when and where we get precipitation, but as the Commissioner already mentioned, we've seen a dramatic increase in extreme precipitation here in New England. In fact, New England has seen the largest increase in extreme precipitation of any place in the country, a 70% increase in the past 50 years in extreme precipitation events. So the challenges of dealing with these huge influxes of water and these irregular influxes of water, any plant operator can tell you, yeah, that's not ideal. And we've seen those not only here, Chicago was a major example where they were having really serious issues with extreme precipitation events and combined sewage overflow just being overloaded and major pollution events as a result of that. And then any pollution that is getting into the environment, whether it's nutrients from septic or sewage outflow or heavy metals or more persistent pollutants that are making their way into the environment, warmer water temperatures are one extra stressor on plants and animals that live in those environments and exacerbate the impacts of that pollution. So the impacts of climate change on water and aquatic ecosystems are really wide-ranging and fundamental. And there are places, as bad as it is here in New England, that are actually feeling this in even more extreme ways than we are. There are currently an island off the coast of Louisiana and one off the coast of Alaska, both home to indigenous populations that have less than a decade left. Those entire populations are going to have to find a new place to live because of sea level rise, and not only sea level rise, but saltwater incursion into their groundwater, and the erosion that also comes with sea level rise and extreme precipitation. Perhaps the most extreme example actually is from the South Pacific, where there are entire nations that are made up of nothing but islands. Kiribati is a nation made up of 32 or 33 coral atoll islands. And that nation is probably, at the very latest, by the end of this century, likely to be part of an entirely new classification of nations called nations ex situ, or states ex situ, which means nations that no longer have any inhabitable land, but exist solely as a disembodied government. Those islands, their highest elevation is 6 or 7 feet above sea level rise, which means that by the end of this century, they're likely to be basically underwater. But well before that, because of saltwater incursion and because of constant flooding from extreme events, they're looking at probably by 2040, 2050, those islands being uninhabitable due to a lack of fresh water and a lack of arable land. And so Kiribati, the president of Kiribati, has actually already entered into agreements with other nations to buy land and to relocate their nation wholesale in order to avoid the impacts of climate change. The kinds of injustice that is inherent in that, that we here in the United States and in New England can be have been a huge part of creating this problem, and yet people on the other side of the world with few resources to deal with it feel the impacts. Those kind of injustices don't just exist on an international level, they exist right here in New England, and I think that's something we have to be really cognizant of as we do try to address these problems. One study looking at the state of Massachusetts in particular, 2 surveys over the past 5 or so years have found that Massachusetts has some of the greatest disparities in the country in terms of environmental injustice, and that in fact the problem seems to be getting worse. And the researchers at Northeastern who have done these surveys actually point their finger in a lot of cases at the policies that we tend to tout as great environmental policies, because when we put into place policies that, for example, say New York can't take their trash offshore in barges, you have to put it somewhere on land. Well, overwhelmingly, those places end up being communities that are poor, that are largely communities of color, and immigrant communities that don't have the financial and political clout to say, no, we don't want another wastewater treatment plant, we don't want another chemical storage facility, we don't want another dump. And so we need to be very aware as we do design our policies and make these decisions going forward, that we have an eye to justice. But I promised that I would get to some good news, and here it is. Those voices, the voices of the people who have been impacted the most, who have typically not had the political clout, were heard loud and clear in Paris in December at the UN climate talks, and I had the privilege of being there for the second week of those talks. A lot of those small nations, island nations, had coined a phrase, 1.5 to survive. So for 10 plus years, the working assumption of UN climate negotiations has been we need to limit our total warming to 2 degrees Celsius of atmospheric warming. Now, I told you we're already at 1 degree, basically. So we're halfway to that. Well, these nations showed up and said, in fact, the science has been progressing, and we now know that 2 degrees would be far too dangerous for our survival. They coined the phrase 1.5 to survive. And I would say that most of the journalists and analysts that were there never expected to see a 1.5 degree target show up in a UN climate agreement. And when the draft came out the final Wednesday, when the talks are supposed to end on Friday, and one of the options for the overall goal statement of this international agreement was to hold global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, there was an audible gasp that went through. And when I say the newsroom, we're talking 3,000 journalists in a multi-level, huge building, basically. There was an audible gasp. And the end result of the Paris climate talks was that that goal is aspirational only. There's no way to make a temperature goal legally enforceable. But the goal of that agreement, which was agreed to by 195 countries, which has already now been signed by, I believe, over 170 countries. It's one of the fastest adoptions of an international agreement and the largest international agreement we've ever seen. The stated goal of that is to hold warming to less than 2 degrees, ideally less than 1.5 degrees Celsius. Can we do that? Not entirely clear, quite honestly. If we're trying to hold warming to 1.5 degrees, we're already 2/3 of the way there, and we've gotten there over the course of 150 years, and we have a very short time, 20, 25 years at the most, to get ourselves to basically zero emissions in order to hit those kinds of goals. It's a huge challenge. But the climate agreement that was reached in Paris, I would say, is a really important first step. I've seen plenty of people dismiss it as overly ambitious and overly difficult to reach and not binding enough and in many other ways unrealistic. But I've also spoken with the President's top science advisor, John Holdren, who says, point blank, no, it's not enough. It was never meant to be enough. It is the critical first step. And I heard from a lot of representatives of the private sector. There were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of businesses at the Paris climate talks saying we need an agreement. States and cities and towns and wastewater treatment plants and water treatment plants have not been waiting around for the UN. While the UN process seemed to be largely stalled, mayors from around the world got together and formed a group called C40, mayors from the 40 largest cities in the world, and they've been working to reduce emissions and talking to each other about how they're doing, what they're doing in their cities and how that can spread. We're seeing states forming alliances, not only with other states in the United States, but with provinces and states in other countries. So in effect, international agreements, but at the state and province level instead of at the federal level, saying we can't wait for federal governments to agree on this, we have to move forward. And I think that's because when you're on the ground and next to the water every single day, you can't deny what you're seeing with your own two eyes. The world is changing and we have to adapt to it. And I think here in New England, we're doing actually a remarkably good job. Every state in New England has a climate action plan or climate legislation on the books. We of course have the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, the first regional cap and trade program in the country, which is helping to bring down emissions from the electricity and power sectors in New England. And I regularly talk to folks, like a few weeks ago I was speaking with a scientist from the Manomet Center for Conservation Sciences, working with the Taunton River Watershed Association to develop a climate adaptation plan and a green infrastructure plan for that watershed that takes into account the irregular flow of water, the rising temperature of the water, and all of these different accounts, and figuring out how do we do this on a watershed by watershed basis, because international agreement or not, eventually it's all going to come down to the local level. And I was speaking with an international diplomacy expert a couple of years ago, and it's kind of, she came up with a phrase that has kind of become my mantra. We've all heard the phrase, all politics is local, all climate is local. This is absolutely a global problem, but the place where we have seen the most action, and I think where we are going to have to continue to see the most action, is at the local level. And so I would encourage you to keep doing the great work that you're already doing, to keep looking forward, knowing that what's ahead is not what we've experienced in the past, that we're moving into a different world. And as you experience either successes or perhaps frustrations that might be worth letting the world know about, let me know about them. Those are stories I would love to be able to tell people about, and let people know what is being done in our communities here in New England to try to adapt to the new world that we live in. So with that, thank you very much again for having me here.
Do we have any questions for Helen before she leaves? No? Yes. So I think that presenting this little gift of gratitude from NEWEA and for your speech today. And we have a special little honorary Select Society of Sludge.
Technical sessions start at 9:15. Please, if you haven't had a chance to register, pick up your information at the front lobby and program, and we'll have a good few days. Thanks so much.